Hello, and welcome to the Extreme History Project Lecture Series. My name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the director of the Extreme History Project. Our mission at Extreme History is to make history relevant, and we do that through this lecture series, through historic walking tours during the summer, bus tours during the summer, a podcast, and so many other things, some historic workshops, all sorts of fun, exciting events. So if you would like to follow us and learn more about what we're doing in the year 2022, go ahead and look at our website, which is extremehistoryproject.org, and you'll be able to follow us and find out what we're up to. Also, if you would like to get emails from us, go to our website and there's a little subscribe button on there. Go and subscribe. That way you'll get events in your inbox. Lectures, walking tours, workshops that we have planned for this year. So go ahead and check that out. Cheryl, who's helping us on the back end here tonight, has put our website in the chat. So you can go ahead and find the website link there as well. So I do have a few housekeeping tips before we begin. We are in webinar format, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you have questions, please write those in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you have thoughts or comments during the presentation, you can write those in the chat button, which is also located at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we encourage you to ask questions, and you can actually even ask questions during the presentation in the Q&A box. And at the end, I will read those for Leslie and Scott. So welcome to the 10th year of the Extreme History Project Lecture Series. I can't believe we've been doing this for 10 years. We have a wonderful lineup of presenters for you this year. We're back to our once a month schedule, so we'll be having a lecture every month this year. And as many of you know, we've traditionally done this lecture series at the Hagar Auditorium in the Museum of the Rockies here in Bozeman. But with COVID, we transitioned to a virtual lecture series. With the uptick in COVID numbers recently, we've decided to stay online with the series through May of this year. And in May, we're going to reevaluate and see if we can go back to the Museum of the Rockies in June. So we'll definitely keep you updated and let you know what we decide. We will, however, continue to offer the Zoom version for those of you who prefer to watch the presentations from the comfort of your own home. If you are new to the Extreme History Project and like to join our mailing list, like I said before, go to our website and join. That way you'll keep up to date on what we're going to be doing with our lecture series and with a lot of our other programming. So thanks to everyone for your support over the past year during this time of COVID. We really appreciate it. If you enjoy what we do here at the Extreme History Project with our lecture series, our walking tours, our workshops, please consider becoming a member. It really helps us bring history to you in fun and engaging ways. And if you don't want the level of commitment that a membership brings, you could just send us a few bucks in the mail, $5, $10, $50, we don't care. Every dollar to us is very helpful. We also take Venmo, so if you want to Venmo us some cash, we would sure love it. Cheryl's going to put our Venmo address in the chat box, along with our physical address if you would just like to send us a check. We would definitely take that as well. So you can find all that information in the chat, our Venmo address, our physical address, and then our membership information is all there. So thank you in advance for your financial support. We very much appreciate it. I'm so excited to have Scott and Leslie with us here tonight. They are both members of the Extreme History Project Board of Directors. Scott is a founding member of the Extreme History Project, along with Marcia Fulton, myself, Shane Doyle, and Kevin Koistra. We are the ones who first started the Extreme History Project about 11 years ago now. And so Scott really helped us formulate what extreme history was going to be all about in those early years. Leslie came onto the board just a few years later, and she is a wonderful working member of the board. All of our board members work, actually, for extreme history, but Leslie does so much. And we value the expertise that both Scott and Leslie have in the fields of historic preservation, architecture, and archaeology. And you all are really in for a treat tonight, learning from them and their expertise. Scott Carpenter is an archaeologist, historian, and architectural historian. He owns Inner Resources Planning and has a professional career extending over 40 years in the private sector and with the National Park Service. Scott is a recognized expert on the National Historic Preservation Act and various state and local regulations, tax credit programs, and preservation planning. Leslie Gilmore is a historic preservation architect whose passion for historic preservation is professional and personal, evidenced by her dedicated involvement in the Association for Preservation Technology, the AIA Historic Resources Committee, Preserve Montana, who we love, and of course, her time with the Extreme History Project. So welcome to you both, and I will hand it over to you, Scott, if you want to share your screen.
I don't see the little green bar. Oh, now I do.
Okay. It's always a challenge finding it.
Well, I find I'm on a bit of a time delay here. There we go.
Oh, Scott, it's showing your.
Yeah, this is the problem we had earlier.
I think if you just say use slideshow, that works.
Where, excuse me, where do you see that?
It's at the top, kind of left. They're right up there.
Oh yeah, hidden behind the mute button.
Yeah.
Got it.
Let's see if that works.
Looks good, except for this crazy thing now.
Okay. We'll get rid of that.
How was your call quality? Well, I was going to tell them about that.
There we go.
You may notice that my video of my face is time delayed about 6 seconds, and that's because I'm broadcasting from the lunar surface tonight. No, I'm all the way up in Big Sky, so I think we're getting a little bit of a time delay. But I think most of the good content we hear is not in the image of my face, but in the screen, and of course in Leslie's face and Crystal's. But we've put together several hours of information into hopefully one short hour to try to give you the best capsule summary of historic preservation. What are the nuts and bolts? A little bit of background about the history of Bozeman and Gallatin County, how historic preservation came to be. And I'm trying to figure out if I can do the, sorry, now I'm trying to do my, there. Anyway, we're trying to give you a background on the history, and then a little bit about how historic preservation in America began and how it grew in Bozeman. And then over the years of doing presentations like this and participating in similar ones, I've compiled a list of quite a few comments, but also myths about historic preservation. And we were thinking that that might be a good way to present this by explaining some of the myths and dispel some of those. We want to extend some great appreciation to Joni Mitchell with some extreme history apologies to using her great line from The Big Yellow Taxi. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, but that's in a nutshell what it is. That historic resources, especially architectural, are irreplaceable, one of a kind. We can have stories about them, we can have books about them, we can have papers, we can have memories, we can have photographs, drawings. But once these bits of architecture are gone, they are truly gone, and that's such a key part. So that's the main thing that we're trying to present here tonight. Our outline, Leslie will start by talking about a thematic history and architectural overview for Bozeman. And it's going to be a real whirlwind tour And hopefully we'll get to expand on that at another time and just give you that in more detail. This will just whet your appetite and give you a little bit of a context. Also, we'll talk about the importance of documented history and preserved architecture, and not just for the sake of architecture itself, but what does it mean to the greater cause for history and recording about our culture. I'll talk briefly on the historic preservation, or the growth and origins and growth of historic preservation in the US, Montana and Bozeman. And then we're going to kind of learn bits and pieces about historic preservation through the 12 myths. And if you haven't fallen asleep by then, we will give a few tips to community members, all the audience, anybody who happens to own a historic home or a historic building, and some links for further study. But we'd really like to hear from you and get your input and your questions, and maybe grow this discussion into some other, hopefully in-person sessions where we can really dive into what it means to preserve and restore and renovate buildings. So I'll pass it off to Leslie for the thematic history.
Thank you, Scott. That's a wonderful introduction. So as Scott mentioned, we're going to go through Bozeman's growth phases that have made it the city it is today. Like most cities, it transformed in response to outside forces over time, and it was not fully formed overnight. And I need to credit our cadre of dedicated and talented historians for their unknowing contributions to this presentation. These are the phases that we'll go through fairly quickly. So I'm not going to read them out now. And I typically don't read slides a whole lot. So we'll move on to the next one and talk about our first inhabitants. And Scott will move on to this great slide that I know is a little confusing because you have to look under the shadow of this aerial photograph and to see all the teepee rings from the hunters and gatherers that were here for thousands of years. The Salish, the Blackfeet, Crows, Nez Perce, and Shoshones at least were some of the tribes that traveled through this hunting valley, this great hunting valley of grounds of Gallatin Valley. This 1956 photo by James Schultz is looking over the teepee rings by the Madison River. And this area, which was primarily Crow country, was known as the Valley of the Flowers for obvious reasons. We'll be talking about the great agricultural land we have here. And then before we kicked out all the first inhabitants, we did have early explorers come through, and the most famous of those are Lewis and Clark. Generally, they came through on their way out west, and they came back and in their journal, in William Clark's journal, on his way back, he was at the mouth of Kelly Canyon, and he was with his 11 members of the expedition. They camped a mile east of here on the flat at the mouth of Kelly Canyon. And the next day, Sacagawea, who was with them, guided the party up the canyon on an old buffalo trail to a pass at the summit of the Gallatin Range. This is also where John Bozeman came through in 1863 on horseback. And the men in the party named the pass at that time for Bozeman. But Sacagawea is credited here for Clark finding his way back home. From there, we get into a different phase of development that's called the town site phase. And you'll hear some of these same phases in Virginia City and Bannock. There's a beginning where you have a lot of log cabin structures because people are coming along from the East Coast, coming for gold, coming to support the miners, which is what a lot of people in Bozeman ended up doing. But this town site phase is primarily getting their feet wet and figuring out how they're going to make their money, and they're building a lot of log structures at that point. And we had Bannock being one of our first, I think they discovered gold in the 1850s, and what was it, Diamond City or Gold City? But Bannock is the first one where they really found enough gold where a lot of people came through and started settling and making money. They discovered that gold in 1862. This is what Bannock looked like in 1881. And then we have our version of that here at Gallatin City. I'm hoping Scott is still actually there and can
Yeah,
forward
I am.
the slides because the next, okay, good. Good. So the next slide is Gallatin City. We do not have much left of it. And this is actually Gallatin City number 2. Gallatin City number 1 started on the west side of the Gallatin, but apparently that was too low and ended up flooding a bit. So and that was 1862. They moved to Gallatin City number 2 in 1865. And that actually became the county seat of Gallatin for a couple of years until Bozeman grabbed the title in 1867. But apparently the soil at Gallatin City just wasn't as good as our rich, fertile soil here in Bozeman. So Bozeman became the county seat and a great supplier for food to the miners and others in the area. So enter John Bozeman. I realized when I was first putting this presentation together that I didn't include John Bozeman at all. And shame on me, because we're named after John Bozeman, who was only here for 7 years, but he came along in 1860 from Georgia, left his wife and children behind. He was looking for gold, just like a lot of people, but was not very successful. So he moved into the guiding business along Bozeman Pass, despite the fact that it was illegal. It was in violation of the 1851 Laramie Treaty. Us settlers were very good at disregarding that treaty. He was not alone in that. So, but also there were a number of Indians in the area, and certainly not happy about having all these few thousands of people come through along the Bozeman Pass. But he got together with Beale, Daniel Rouse and William Beale in 1864, and they started platting out Bozeman and laying it out. Hopefully we'll see a layout of that. Essentially at Main Street on the north side between Rouse and Bozeman was the first platting of Bozeman. And it grew from there to the northeast, to the northwest, to the south, and kept growing considerably. And I don't know why we're not getting, there we go, there you go. So, and granted, this is a later Sanborn, but that gives you an idea of where all this is happening. And I show this because it does also show Bozeman Creek, which is certainly one of the reasons why you settle at a certain area. We often settle where there's water. The Bozeman was killed in 1867, and I'm sure Crystal, if you ask, will provide more detail about that statement. His death at the time was thought to be at the hands of Indians, so that caused a bit of a panic, which prompted the government to build Fort Ellis. And Fort Ellis was there to protect the citizens of Bozeman and the Gallatin Valley until 1886, when essentially it wasn't needed any longer. But you'll see that it's a fairly sizable settlement in its own right. They had 200 to 300 soldiers there at a time. This really helped Bozeman because Bozeman needed to help feed these soldiers. And they provided fresh food from the farms and ranches of the area to be able to feed the soldiers, as well as all these settlers coming into Bozeman proper. And Main Street became a real commercial mecca, while still hosting several log homes and frame residences as well. Nelson Story's 1869 frame residence was at the west end of Main Street until it was moved twice in order to, and it's still in Bozeman, but not on Main Street. But Main Street was originally quite a mix of residences and commercial enterprises, but you'll start to see now, even in 1870, that there are frame buildings and false fronted frame buildings so that they can look more substantial than they really were. Take note of Tilton's Mercantile there, because you'll see a very different Tilton's Mercantile later in 1889. And then the Cooper Block, which was put up in 1872 on the right there, you'll see 11 bays. This building is still standing in Bozeman, and this is one of our early first really substantial buildings. 7 of those original 11 bays remain today, and most of the other structures don't remain any longer because, as you'll see, we developed a much more substantial settlement for purposes that we'll go into. But this early settlement phase, you can tell we're really planning to stay. We have a lot of hopes for our prosperity because we established a library in 1872, a newspaper in 1869, the telegraph line in 1871, the first bank in 1872. So there's a lot going on. And that led us into what we call the village phase from 1873 to 1883, where we saw the arrival of railroads. This was our first 1883 railroad, a frame building, which was planted in 1892 with an even more substantial brick railroad that was a passenger depot that was added onto in 1923 as well. But developers were really looking at the railroads as a way to bring prosperity to the valley. They began planting even more additions in Bozeman on land all around that original town site. The area really became urbanized. The Transcontinental Railroad arrived in 1883, and the city of Bozeman was incorporated. We were one of the fortunate towns where the railroad came to us, as opposed to us having to relocate to where the railroad was, or maybe missing it entirely. And our civic phase was from 1884 to 1912, and a lot of it revolved around trying to become the capital of the new state in 1889. We didn't decide on the capital until 1892, but we were vying for it with a number of other cities. We got what was called the Consolation Prize by getting the Montana State College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts. And I think a lot of us have found that this compromise, this consolation prize, was really a great prize, and it's really helped us weather the 1873, the 1893, the 1933, the various depressions that we've had over time. It's really helped the town stabilize financially. And we also had other, essentially, we really came of age during this time. And if you'll see on the next slide what Main Street is looking like in the 1890s, we are ready to host the Capitol. And this is actually 1900, but very similar to what we saw in 1890. Look at all these brick buildings and stone and storefronts. It's a real civic phase where we've got a lot of commercial enterprises going on. And you can see, I wish Dale Martin were here. Maybe he is. He could explain all those lines that are, look at the huge number of horizontal bars for the electric lines and telegraph lines. And it's really pretty impressive what we were accomplishing. Now, we also had a powerhouse intersection that I call from at Main and Rouse, where we had, on the next slide, you'll see the Opera House and the, which was also the firehouse on the left, built in 1890. And then on the right, you'll see the Bozeman Hotel and the Tilton Block, which was a mercantile built in 1889. The only building of these three remaining at this point is the Bozeman Hotel. A little different. It doesn't have those balconies anymore. The Opera House was torn down in 1966, and the Tilton Block came down actually probably a year or two before that for the new City Hall. But this phase also impacted our residential areas. And so you'll see some of these, yes, go to that beautiful slide of John Kopp's house that was built in 1903. These are the similar houses that the Queen Anne's that were built all over town. We have some very substantial buildings that really rivaled any of those in eastern towns because we had people that were making a lot of money and they also wanted to show it. And then the best case that we have for conspicuous consumption is Nelson Story's house that was at the west end of Main Street, built in 1888, designed by Byron Freeland, who also designed that Opera House. Conspicuous consumption really doesn't get much more elaborate than this in any town, which did not save it from the wrecking ball, however, in 1938 to provide more room for the high school. And then we move on. We still progress. Beyond that, we have what we call the progressive phase from 1913 to 1929. We ended up really responding to the use of the automobile. We had a lot of transformation resulting from transportation. We had, Main Street was dumbbelled with what became the equivalent to motels and gas stations. We were really catering to the automobile. We also were finding that the Ag College was focusing on efficiency and modernization. And so it really had a huge impact of resultant economic advantages in agriculture and increases in livestock and in irrigated farming. This site here actually is where the Lewis and Clark Motel was built in the 70s. And then, yes, go on to the next slide where we see the 1927 Gallatin Gateway Inn. Granted, this isn't in Bozeman, but this is all related to Bozeman because we benefited greatly from the opening of Yellowstone National Park in 1972 and the transportation of people going down to Gallatin Gateway, staying at the inn and moving on into the park. And again, this is prompted by the use of the automobile. And then we move on to what's called a nationalization phase because really we were impacted by the rest of the country, obviously, and we were impacted by the Great Depression, and we benefited by it as well. We received WPA, Works Progress Administration, and PWA money, both the Atkinson Quadrangle and the Armory, as well as several other buildings in Bozeman benefited from funding, from national funding. And we also started connecting more with the outside world through the radio and through movies. And so we were not just a rural community isolated at all by any means. And we show this in the post-war expansion phase at all, because as well, from 1946 through 1970, like a lot of communities, we really prospered with the return of the GIs. And show the next slide, please, showing the brick breeden field house built to accommodate our burgeoning population of 15,000 people in the county in 1956-57. And granted, this was an engineering marvel as well, but we also responded to, again, the automobile. I-90 was being completed at this time. We were building out on North 7th. We were building Main Street all the way to 19th. And so obviously we're continuing with this sort of development at this point. And this also affected the residential areas, as you'll see in the 1950 Hellburn House on the next slide. Richard Neutra of international fame had come to give a talk at MSC and received this commission to design the Hellburn House. If you haven't had a chance to get into it, it's really lovely. And we also received a number of simple ranch houses that you'll see on this next slide, 1963, a lot of ranch houses, a lot of residential to be able to house the returning vets and the swelling population. Now, I'll let Scott talk about what we can do with our understanding of our history. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, thanks, Leslie. And we're going to go into the next little bit of information on the importance of documented history and preserved architecture. I think any of you who are attending who are familiar with extreme history and a lot of the other lectures done from archaeology to history to architecture understand that it's not just one of those fields that adds the information for our history. Archaeology can't answer all the questions, oral histories can't answer all the questions. Heaven forbid, John Bozeman's letters may not be able to answer all the questions because he had his own interest involved. And likewise, architecture. But if we add all of those things together, it adds more of the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle that forms
the framework of our history and our culture and tells us.
And to a large extent, documented histories like, excuse me for all of this popping back up. The documented histories in large volumes and a lot of books, a lot of things are not easily accessible to folks. They don't have the time to sit down and read these and really amass. There's some good summaries out there on Bozeman history, recent book on Nelson's story, a lot of others that give us a lot of insight. But architecture is really an accessible part. In just a few moments, somebody can walk by or drive by an interesting historic building and at least spark their attention. It's not hard for most people to see a historic building and know that it's historic compared to a recent building that's been constructed to be made to look historic. So those things are important, and that's what we really want to emphasize tonight. Let's see. And basically I've covered this. Again, the preserved historic architecture sites and the built environment are irreplaceable artifacts. Once they're gone, and we've lost that one single piece of the history. I want to talk a little bit about a project that I worked on, and actually Richard Brown, who may still be on the list of attendees tonight, he helped out a lot on this project. You'll see some of his drawings. But in 2009, there was a horrific gas explosion on Main Street in March. Killed one person, destroyed 3 buildings, greatly damaged 2 others, which had to be dismantled after a while. But the Osborne Building was one of those that was greatly damaged, and we were called in to help document that building, find out about its significance. It was already listed in the Main Street Historic District, was eligible for the National Register, but we wanted more information before we knew that that building might just fall over. You know, we also worked with engineers to try to figure out how to piece the building together, or at least the important facade of that building, to try to maintain that today, but it just was not feasible, and was a major safety concern during construction and later. Quite a history on the Osborne Building, built in 1882 by Samuel Osborne. He had his original drugstore, which is shown here on the lower left, which was a log cabin about in the same location, just west of the Bozeman Hotel on Main Street, East Main Street. When he, during that expansion phase of the city of Bozeman, where we went from frame to brick buildings, the Osborne Building here centered in the 1890 photograph with a parade going by, gave us a lot of information about that phase of Osborne's history, but also the development of Main Street. The Seabury, Ferris, and White Hardware were fortunate to have a photograph of the interior of that. And you see the great electric lights with the kerosene lanterns for sale in the background, but the electric lights, because the electricity came in to run the railroad or the streetcars in the city. It also brought a lot of electricity, or not a lot, but enough electricity to all the shops and structures on Main Street. Anyway, in 2009, the explosion occurred. And again, you can see here where it in just an instant was one of the most catastrophic losses to Bozeman, loss of life, but to also to historic preservation. It lost a big chunk of the historic downtown area. And this is kind of a reference photo. The only building in this view that survives today in its previous condition is the Montana Rug Gallery. I think that's the former Montgomery Ward's building on the corner there at the far left. But the Boodles restaurant was destroyed, Rockin' Our Bar, Montana Trails Gallery, and some of the other shops that were there. The American Legion building, the facade was still standing, but basically nothing was intact to keep that building. And then the Osborne Building. And as you can see, the facade of this building was pretty well intact, but had some substantial masonry cracks, and all of the interior walls and some of the floors, they were holding the structure together, and including the roof, had a lot of holes in it from the debris from the buildings on the left that went up in the air and came back down. So it was quite a project, and but we couldn't save the building. Thanks a lot to Richard Brown, his drawing on the left. We did a thorough historic documentation research and what's called a Historic American Building Survey documentation. Richard did his drawings. We went through, and because the building was already partly dismantled, we could actually take apart part of it and do some reverse archaeology on the building itself to figure out how it was made and when different additions were made and things like that. And the Osborne Building serves as a great example. And although it was an the loss of this building, the demolition of the building, was due to an uncontrolled catastrophe. Fortunately, the property owner funded the historic and architectural documentation and considered engineering alternatives to preserve the key features of the facade in the original building, which was, in the end, was not actually able to be done. But there's the loss of many, many buildings and historic buildings in Bozeman that are not the result of catastrophe, that it's due to changes in development, needs for new buildings, improved buildings, larger buildings, things like that. And buildings are just dismantled and destroyed. And a lot of these are demolished without the benefit of historic preservation planning and without consideration without consideration for retaining the key historic architectural features that give that sense to the community. Even if something is modernized, it's nice to keep that aesthetic feel of what the historic buildings were able to provide in the past. And then a lot of buildings are lost without any documentation. So often we have very little to go on as to what the building was used for. Several generations later, people forget what used for, and there's just not much information there. Now we're going to jump into the history of the historic preservation in the US. And this is just, this literally could take a whole semester class. So we've condensed it in about 8 or 9 lines on one page. But the need to remember the past, to collect artifacts, to have memories, have legends, things like that, go back thousands and thousands of years, oral histories, cave paintings in France, things like that. There's almost an innate feeling with humans through all cultures to really have a connection with the past. In the United States, it was in the 1800s, late 1800s, with mid to late, with the acquisition and preservation of George Washington's Mount Vernon and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Virginia. And they formed nonprofit associations in those times to maintain and keep those going because of their historic and architectural importance. The Antiquities Act of 1906, which allowed for the creation of national monuments in our country, also preserved places like Mesa Verde National Park for the early prehistoric architecture that was there. Also, one good example, there's many, many of them throughout the United States. We had the preservation of local preservation societies, such as the one in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1930s, early work in New York, Virginia, Florida, places like that. And then we had the National Historic Sites Act in 1935, which was the first time that a national policy was actually documented to preserve for public use historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance. And this later grew into the National Historic Preservation Act. Then in the 1960s, there was, with a lot of urban renewal and a lot of development and advancement that Leslie was talking about specifically in Bozeman, but throughout the country with the interstate highway movement, the movement of railroads, things like that, there was a lot of destruction of the old to make way for the new. And the demolition of Penn Station, a classic architectural icon in New York City, it was destroyed in 1964 without any consideration for preservation or even incorporating the old designs into the new building that would be there. And out of that grew the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which was just 10 years before the bicentennial of the United States. And with some foresight, realizing that we needed about 10 years to really work on documenting the important sites that we wanted to start honoring in 1976 with the bicentennial. The National Historic Preservation Act, which also includes the National Register of Historic Places, to at least acknowledge those significant historic buildings and sites. Doesn't have a lot of complete or absolute protection, but it does list them so that even if they are lost, we will at least have that documentation. And I think Leslie is going to start now and talk about historic preservation in Bozeman.
Thank you. One thing that we do find is that local ordinances are what are going to provide more protection for historic properties
We don't-
typically
I don't
than
think we're
national
hearing
policies.
you, Leslie.
Oh,
Are you on mute?
okay. I'm not on mute.
We can hear, okay, Scott. Maybe it's just
Oh.
you. Yeah, we can hear, so,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So I'll just keep talking and hopefully
Fine.
Scott will find a way to hear me so that he'll be able to know when to change slides. That's the easiest way we found to do it. But
This is what
the
you get
quote
when
you
you
see
do
up
2 or
here on
3
the
dry
slide is,
runs.
yeah. Can you hear me now, Scott?
Oh, yeah,
Okay, well, I'll hope that, okay. So the quote that you see on the slide is actually from the website for the Historic Preservation Program in Bozeman. And it's a fine quote in the sense that it recognizes that it's not just saving old buildings, but it's saving a sense of place and a sense of community, and bridges the gap between, I'm sorry, the little speaker showed up on there. I think Scott's working on hearing me. So it bridges the gap between the past and our future. And it's also about recognizing and celebrating our community's values. And I'm hoping he can switch the slide, because otherwise I'll just keep talking to this point.
Scott, if you would like to switch the slide, that'd be great.
Maybe we should chat with him.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you. Okay. So, but now we get to, now we get to dive into the Unified Development Code of Bozeman. And it is what deals with development throughout the whole city. And it does have a section on historic preservation. And we're trying not to inundate you with code, but it does have some changes that occurred in December of 2021, because as you may know, the city now has super boards, but they retained the Historic Preservation Advisory Board. However, that board, and we'll get into that, doesn't do the reviews that we would expect for historic properties. Okay, now I'm hearing myself echo. The Design Review Board or the Administrative Design Review staff, Sarah Rosenberg, will review the projects and make recommendations to what is called the final authority, which is the City Commission. And we know that the City Commission does not always agree with staff, and that's their purview, but they are given strong recommendations that are informed by the staff and the Design Review Board. And the properties that are reviewed are those that are in the Neighborhood Conservation Overlay District, perfect, which we can go ahead and go on to that slide. But so the intent is to restore and rehabilitate as many of these properties as possible. And the blue outline there is essentially what Bozeman was in the 1950s. And it's the Neighborhood Conservation Overlay District. So it's sort of an overlay over the regular zoning. And you also have these large colorful globs of kind of odd shapes that are 9 historic districts. We also have a 10th historic district, which was nominated and accepted, oh gosh, might even have been 5 years ago now, with the MSU Historic District, the core of the campus there. But we've got the 9 historic districts, and many of you might live in them: Cooper Park, Bonton, South Tracy, South Black, South Tracy Avenue, Lindley Place, Main Street, North Tracy Avenue, the Bozeman Brewery, and Story Mill in the upper right there with quite the odd shape, which includes our Northern Pacific Passenger Depot. There are also 46 individually listed properties, and those are the red blobs that you see along there. There are also many more buildings that are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And some of them have been documented as being eligible, and others we're still, Bozeman is still working on trying to survey more and more of their properties so that we know what we have. Now, the next slide, I think, should talk to the Bozeman Historic Preservation Advisory Board, which per the updated December 15th, 2021, really is a division designed to measure and to establish a local historic preservation program that will promote and protect historic and prehistoric sites. They will also identify and evaluate historic resources and provide education and guidance to homeowners and business owners, building owners. But it isn't doing the board, and hopefully the members and the audience that are part of the board now at this point, the Preservation Board is not doing reviews that are binding in any sense. They might be asked on an informal basis, as we were when Crystal and I served on the board. Was that 8 years ago? And for a period of about 8 years, we actually saw an informal presentation of the Rock and Arbar new buildings. David Licati came with Celia Vanneman to show the designs to us, and we commented, but we didn't have any review power, but it was a very, very nice gesture on their part. And I think we did have some impact on what the design was ultimately. And the next slide, I think should talk about, yes, the Unified Development Code, talking about what the board can and cannot do. And essentially they're making recommendations to the City Commission. And then the next slide will talk about when a building is deemed unsafe. And we have brought this slide up and the next slides because of the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital probable potential demolition that's on board because the building has been deemed unsafe by the chief building official. And whether that's a temporary or permanent condition is not a factor in this. Once the building is deemed unsafe, the whole review process is thrown by the wayside and the building can be demolished. It does have to still be documented. And I don't know if they have as thorough a HABS documentation requirement as they used to. I think that's something that the city negotiates with the developer. But how this impacts us is that we can lose a strong part of our history of a building that has been considered deemed eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places and was part of our very rich heritage of the deaconesses bringing a hospital here. It was one of the 4 deaconess hospitals within the state. And there was a great fundraising effort to build it in 1920 and have it designed by our own Fred Wilson. But if we show the site plan on the next slide, we'll see that we easily could lose this building. It's in the middle of the site there, the yellow tan, where it will be, under the current plan, it will be demolished. The city does have to have a public notice of this, and that is to be a mailed notice to nearby residences and businesses that could be affected. And you'll see there's very modest single-family housing surrounding this site where there will be very tall buildings on the part of the new development. But the city is still required per the Unified Development Code, even with this demolition of a unsafe building, they are still mandated to consider the property's historic significance. And as I said, the building was deemed eligible for listing in the National Register, so we will at least get it documented. This is a great place to move on to Scott's myths busting and then be able to move on to conversation from there. Thank you. If Scott can talk.
Scott, are you there? I think we're working on getting Scott back and unmuted. I think Scott is muted, so we can't hear you, Scott. Okay, Scott, we can't hear you. So let's see, I'm going to try to get Scott back on board here.
He might be intending at this point that we just read them as he has laid them out here very nicely. So we could start going through them, I think, in the interest of time.
Okay.
Well, Chris, although the slides are going pretty quickly.
Okay. Okay. Leslie, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so here's myth number one. If a property gets designated as historic or is listed as part of a historic district, it's protected forever and can never be demolished. Well, that's not the case at all, particularly if there is no federal funding. Oh, I like the texts that are going on here. But the historic designation sometimes ensures a more thorough review of demolition proposals, but it doesn't prohibit demolition outright. And as I said, if there's national funding, then there has to be a Section 106 review. If we can, I don't know if, oh, good, we can. Okay. And historic designation will reduce my property values. We haven't shown the numbers up here, but the National Trust has done a number of studies over the years that shows that historic designation actually improves property values compared with similar non-historic values. And historic districts are a similar case where those values go up as well. And I think you'll see that in real estate ads. People love to move to historic districts and live in historic properties. And myth number three. I can't remember. Okay. If my property is designated as a historic building or site, I won't be able to change it in any way. And I don't want my property to become a museum. Well, you can make changes. And as I mentioned earlier, when we have local review, we often, that can be more stringent than a national review. I can buy a historic property and pretty much do anything I want to with it unless there's a local ordinance or I'm using federal funding or a tax credit or easements in some fashion like that, where there are strings attached. But for the most part, we hate to tell people, but you can easily demolish a lot of historic buildings, which is what we're seeing happening in Bozeman, because some of them just aren't of the scale that apparently our new development really wants to be at. Oh gosh, I wish I'd written out the other myths. Sorry.
We're trying to get Scott back.
Crystal,
Yeah,
yes, we are. Okay.
We currently lost Scott, but you know what we could do right now is we could open it up to some questions, Leslie, and see if we get Scott back. The rest of the presentation was going to be some of those myths that are really good. So hopefully Scott will come back on. But in the meantime, if you all out there have some questions that Leslie can answer, why don't we go to questions for a few minutes here and see if we can get Scott back. Any questions? I see a lot going on in the chat. Let's see.
Discussion about the Henry Building.
Yeah.
To be built at the southwest corner of Tracy and Villard. I understand a boutique hotel is being proposed for the current hospital site. There's been a fair amount of coverage in the paper about what home base is planning there. And it is through, I think it's been going through some site planning phases. But I also saw that Craig Lee had a comment here saying that he didn't think that the public comment session had ended yet, which is interesting to hear. It gets a little confusing because they do site planning, I think, first, and then they get more individually into the buildings that will be affected by the new development. And so it's more than just one review and more than one public review that goes through it. And maybe Crystal has more to add there.
So I don't have much more to add there. I know that the main public comment has been closed, but there, like you said, Leslie, there might be some additional public comment that is still open, but we encourage everybody, if you do want to make a public comment on the Henry Building or the loss of the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, if you email the commissioners, the city commissioners, and tell them your concerns with that, that would be wonderful. The email address is Maybe Cheryl can look that up and get that in the chat. It's agenda. Oh, I don't know it off the top of my head, but we'll get that in the chat for you before the end of the conversation here. But Leslie, David Carlson is asking, okay, Rob put it in the chat, agenda@bozeman.net. Thanks, Rob. But David Carlson is asking, does historic preservation conflict with energy efficiency upgrades? And Leslie, you're a good one.
Oh, I think that's one of the myths. That's one of the myths we get to bust. It can, and sometimes it does, but generally what we're finding, at least for buildings that were built before 1940, because of the way they were built, they have latent energy in the masonry, and they have tall ceilings and tall windows, and they rely on cross ventilation. And often the way they're built actually lends itself to improving the energy use greatly. And we often talk about windows and how we can add storm windows to existing windows and get the same U value and same performance that we would get from a brand new window. But there have, and this is where Scott was going to talk very eloquently about embodied energy. And there have been a lot of studies done lately about the carbon footprint of demolishing a building versus building a new building. And what they call the embodied energy uses up a lot of carbon used up a lot of carbon already. So when they built the Bozeman Hotel, they excavated the site, they got building stone from somewhere. They used a lot of manpower and maybe mechanical power to get the stone out, and then the transportation to bring that stone to the building and to manufacture the brick that went into the building. So it's called essentially from cradle to grave, from the very beginning of that material to when it gets installed in the building. And so the glass is included in that as well, and sand that goes into the concrete, that goes into the glass, which we actually have a shortage of at this point. So all that energy that got put into making a building and then operating it over, say, a 70-year time frame, if you're looking at demolishing a 70-year-old building, that's a lot of carbon. And then you compare that to the amount of carbon that's going to have to go into, first of all, demolishing that building, and how much of those materials can you reuse. Sometimes it's a high percentage, sometimes it's very low percentage, just depending on what the materials are. But we do see a lot of reuse of brick and of wood in particular. But so you demolish, you salvage that building, and then you excavate anew, you build new, you pour new concrete, you build new steel or wood, and all that embodied and all that energy that went into creating those products, those new products, and delivering them. It can be a 65-year time frame to have a real payback for when that new building finally is not exceeding the embodied energy that was in the original building in the first place. And we're frankly, the tax code essentially encourages us not to use buildings beyond, 39 years or something like that. And a lot of new buildings aren't lasting 70 years. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think it was, can we make a building energy efficient? And yes, we can. And preservation architects have been working through this and doing a really, really good job of helping to make buildings far more energy efficient while using a clean energy grid wherever they can. What was the other thing I was thinking about that really relates to that? We often look at like a residential building and say you want more energy efficient windows. If you replace them, they have with say a new window, it actually it's such a small square footage of your envelope that you're it's a long payback to make it worthwhile to even buy those new windows. And the Extreme History has the window remodeling kit that Preserve Montana has put together, along with a very good guide about how to restore your windows. And I've done it. It's not fun, but it was effective for the brick bungalow that we lived in.
Yes,
Don't get me going on any more questions.
So if anyone is interested in replacing their historic windows and their historic windows in their historic homes, we do have a replacement kit, a kit that you can use to do that. That is wonderful. Just get a hold of us and you can lend it for up to 3 weeks or 6 weeks or however long you need to borrow it for. The great kit that was given to us by Preserve Montana, and we lend it out. Now, Leslie, another question from Linda is,
mhm.
as a member of the Historic Preservation Advisory Board here in Bozeman, at what process in the approval of site plans were you able to make effective comments as a board?
Right. I don't recall being able to really make many insightful comments, except, I mentioned that we were pulled in to review the Rock and Arbor, but I really think that was a matter of courtesy. We did review the expansion of the church. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but, kitty corner from City Hall, the county building. They tore down the convent and expanded the church. And again, I think it was a courtesy. And I don't remember ever really being asked by the city or being allowed by dint of the definition of our board to be able to provide comments that were actually included as part of a review by the city. We have had excellent historic preservation officers, though, and I think that staff has a greater chance of getting listened to by the city commission. And so we've had staff that will write recommendations to the city commission. And maybe Crystal and I don't know if Mark Hofstetler's on the line. He was the board chair for a while. He might remember more. I came away, one of the reasons I left the board was because we were feeling underutilized.
Yeah, and the Historic Preservation Advisory Board was able to make a little bit of headway in the last few years, and now they should be able to. I'm not on the board any longer. I went off about a year ago, but as about a year ago, we were able to make comment and recommendations on demolitions that were happening within historic districts. So you might want to ask Sarah Rosenberg about that, Linda. So hopefully that is still something that the board can review and do.
Right, because I did go back to the Unified Development Code to look at the changes that were made in December and didn't see anything about demolition review by the Preservation Board. I don't know if that's something that was taken out. I don't think I have a version of the UDC from before that to compare to. It'd be interesting to see if there's been a loss of responsibility or a shifting, I guess would be another way to phrase it. Yeah. I'd also like to add, my husband texted me.
And Scott is back.
My husband texted. Let me just quickly say that my husband texted me that, and I was really remiss. MSU has renovated a number of historic buildings, and within the LEED certified program, with LEED, the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and Romney Hall, I think is silver or gold, and various other historic buildings on campus. And MSU is not alone in doing this. A lot of other campuses and a lot of other historic buildings have attained LEED certification. Right. We got gold LEED certification for the Haynes Photo Shop in Yellowstone National Park. So you can make it equivalent to new construction. And then Scott can answer the rest of the myths.
So welcome back, Scott. We were just—
Are you really back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I am really sorry about that. I really was not supposed to tell you that I am broadcasting from the surface of Mars, but I'm now in that silent black zone on the opposite side. Apologize. But it's strange. My computer completely froze, except I could move a slide forward or backward. And then Barb brought her iPad in, which gave you a terrible feedback. So had to deal with all that. So it's probably not worth going through all the myths. I think you get the gist of it, and the questions have been great. So if I can backtrack with anything, I was listening out of one ear while I was trying to resolder my entire computer. So
we have another question that both of you can tackle. Sarah Scott asked, Andy Halloran was the instigator for tearing down the Mercantile in Missoula, the Mercantile building. Is there a way to work with developers to help understand the great loss of tearing down these buildings and how that creates a great loss for our historic preservation community? So do either of you have any ideas on how we can work with folks who are interested in tearing down buildings to help them better understand the importance of these historic places to the community and to the people who live here?
Great question. And I think, of course, Leslie can add a lot to that. There are some other historic architects around the state and around the region who have, through trial and error and actually doing the work, have come up with answers to those. Everything from energy savings to retrofitting and new additions and saving the important things. So we could get them in touch with a lot of those folks to add to that. Leslie?
Well, it does make me think. I mean, we do have Cher just on the line, and she's with Preserve Montana, and maybe it's the type of thing where we should sit down with him, or he's not the only developer, but with someone like Andy Halloran, and actually just talk with him and show him what we do know and what else can be done from around the country. My concern is that, and maybe it's partly the way I look at things, but developers are always looking at the bottom line. And so we would have to talk with them very much about the bottom line. And I think we could be prepared to do that. We would just have to have our ducks in a row. But he will not make the same kind of money probably from a Bozeman Deaconess Hospital renovation than he would from whatever much larger building he's going to put him in its place.
I think a footnote using the Deaconess Hospital is that there could be creative ways to, and I'm not sure because I'm not an engineer and I'm not an architect, but it has been done in other places in the United States where facades are integrated into the back. A great example is a building in Bozeman, Montana, the Armory. And that was a extremely significant Wilson building, mid 20th century. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people hated it because of its almost brutalist concrete design. But obviously you could not make a hotel out of the Armory and get your per square footage revenues back. And a lot of people don't like the present design, but they were able to set the new building on top back from the facade. So it just didn't incorporate and engulf the facade, it actually set back. I think there are a lot of other things they could have done with paint color and materials and other things that the new part could have not mimicked it, but been a little bit more compatible. But if we were able to go back to that slide at this point, which don't ask me to do that, you can see how it's set back and you can still see the original facade of the Armory building. So I think that's a possibility that in design at the Deaconess Hospital, that at least that core element with the glazed terracotta tile columns and various other details, the fenestration or window placement of the building, the brick pattern, the colors, things like that, you could end up with a building that behind that facade met all the new modern development needs, but still kept something which isn't as great as keeping the original building. But if the original building isn't usable for whatever reason, safety, design, or economics, at least we get part of it that then goes with the history and the documentation, the photographs, oral histories, and everything else, that it's a compromise.
Yeah.
The key thing would be to be on board early in the design process, because once a design is already, into, schematic design development, then you're almost too late. So you need to be at the table at the beginning to be able to throw out ideas like that and explore other ways of, using parts or all of an existing building. But I think Scott's got it. I mean, I think your direction is a really keen one.
So we have one more question from Becca Shields, and she says, in your opinion, what are some of the most endangered places in Bozeman? Do you think there are some buildings Bozeman is likely to lose in the future?
I think the potential for losing all of them is there. And it takes advocacy and vigilance to try to get a bit more teeth into the planning process, both the historic preservation planning with the city and also with developers, so that it's not an adversarial relationship. It ends up being a team relationship. And, you know, maybe there's a time 100 years from now when we look back on the buildings that were built from 1995 to 2025 and say, wow, that's really sharp architecture. I sometimes am not sure if that's going to be the case, but it would be nice to have a blend of a lot of things. So I think that if the effort is there to show developers how important it is to have the aesthetic appeal and charm and actual materials and fabric of original buildings left intact, I think that's so important.
Sounds like a room for a workshop, if we could get people to come.
Yeah, you know, and I think that a lot of our neighborhoods, you know, we have to look to our neighborhoods too. We're losing a lot of structures in our neighborhoods, and our neighborhoods are the character, the historical character of those neighborhoods are in danger, and especially with this new development, the Henry that we've been talking about, that encompasses the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. There's a historic district that butts right up against that, the North Tracy Historic District, and some of our most historically important houses, like the house that is right next to that development that you were talking about, Leslie, a single, a two-story house, a couple two-story houses that are right next to that development that are going to be looking out directly to a 7-story building right across the street from them. So that is some of the concern as well. And so these big areas butting up right against our beautiful historic districts.
I know we talked about having a buffer zone around historic districts where you'd still have some review and some lessening of the zoning density and therefore heights as well, and maybe it would be setbacks and things like that. And we've always talked about that the buffers would be a great idea in terms of protecting the actual historic districts. And maybe we need to see what we can do in terms of changing our UDC and hopefully having people understand the value of that.
Another question from Rob is, could you speak to when demolition is an appropriate part of the equation? For example, the original county courthouse building was replaced.
Yeah, I don't know why that was replaced. I actually saw a photo of that one recently, and we do like progress, and we do need progress. And I know Scott mentioned that we like to have a variety, and we don't want the Main Street to have the same building all the way up and down it. So that's you ask a really pointed and difficult question, Rob. Thank you. But I guess, certainly if a building really is in bad shape, and I don't know what the condition with the county courthouse was. The other thing is if it really can't be modified for the new use, and with the county courthouse, I don't think it would have been a new use, but maybe they used the rooms differently or it needed to have more courtrooms. I really don't know. It'd be an interesting story to get down into, and maybe you're going to be sorry you gave that as an example, because I seem to keep harping on that one. But not every building is a landmark. We do, however, want to have a fabric, like a background of what our historic character is. And I don't think anyone is hoping or even thinking that we can save absolutely every building. And as I said, we did have a landmark. We had Nelson Story's home, which I mean, it would have been classified as a landmark in today's society, but even still, you know, that building couldn't be saved. And we certainly cannot save them all. I know there was a historian in Chicago, Robert Brugman, who thought that we should rank the buildings in terms of their significance. So the high level of 1, 2, 3, 4, and you know, so and like what we have now in historic districts, where we call a building contributing or non-contributing. So if a building is considered non-contributing, sure, greater license in terms of demolishing it. But even non-contributing buildings add to that fabric. So it's a very difficult question, but I think that we have to remember that no, we're not going to save everything, and we shouldn't, because we do. I mean, we wouldn't have Frank Lloyd Wright's historic district in Oak Park, Illinois, if we had had binding review of demolition when he was designing structures there. But, and you know, Scott made the comment, we don't know what's going to become a landmark, what will be a new landmark. I think we just have to focus on good design, thoughtful design, and design that fits in well with its context, and realize that we're not going to save everything and that we shouldn't even be trying to.
Good answer, good answer. So another question is, what is the status of the Story Mansion? The exterior paint seems to be in very poor condition. Do you know if the city has any plans to maintain this property? And Sam, I'll just let you know that we are going to have our March lecture is going to be by Felix Spinelli, who is actually I don't know if he's still the president of the Friends of the Story Mansion, but he's a big part of that. And he's going to be talking about the Story Mansion and kind of what the history of it, but also what's happening now, and then what's they hope to happen in the future. So tune in March for the answer to that question. And then we have one last question here from someone that says, Leslie mentioned early on about a home that she considers beautiful and that we should see it if we've not seen it. She didn't catch the name of the home, and the photo was on a slide. Would you please repeat that, Leslie?
Sure, that'd be the Neutra house on, is it Church or Sourdough? You know, you go south of Kagi, and it must be Church at that point on the west side of the street. It has an early sod, well, early yet old sod roof. We used to have sod roofs in the pre-settlement days, but there's so Richard Neutra, international of international fame. It's the Hellburn House from 1950. I don't know if there was an owner that also owns the old City Hall building. I don't know if they still own it. They used to rent it out, but you can't see much when you drive by it. You can see the slope of and the grass of the slope, slightly slope roof. It has a lot of glass, which you expect from Neutra, but it's really bizarre because it actually has sort of log construction, horizontal logs so he's trying to make it kind of rustic and Montana-like. I'd love to see if there's, anything written about how he came to the design he did. The feeling inside the building is really lovely. And you can really embrace the exterior through these full height, full length windows that are, typical for modern residences.
All right, thanks, Leslie. So that is the end of the questions. Let me just make sure I got out of them. Yep, I got them all. So Scott, it looks like you put up the resources that you were talking about. If you want to talk through this a little bit. Yeah,
I definitely didn't want to start the show again and freeze the computer. So ignore all the perimeter stuff here, but this does show my and Leslie's contact information. I think a good source for people to pursue is looking at the web pages and the various webs beneath that of the City of Bozeman Historic Preservation. Talks about the ordinance and the overlay district and how the process works. Another handy thing, especially if you're an owner of a historic home or a building or a commercial structure, is the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. And there's that link. If you would like, send me an email. You only have to write down one link or take a screenshot, and I can send all these to you. But the Secretary of Interior standards really talks about how certain things can be done to bring the new along with historic buildings in terms of roofs and fences and exterior additions and solar panels, all sorts of things like that. So that's really handy. And then we also included which I think you talked about earlier, but I was filling with technology, trying to get up to date here. But there is the email address there for bozeman.net to add any comments. And I think, did you already discuss that the comment period is over? But comments are comments, and sometimes comments after the comment's over may be more important than earlier. So
Yeah, we encourage folks to still send comments about the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital or that whole development, if you are interested in doing that, to agenda@bozeman.net. Okay, and I think with that, we will end. Leslie, Scott, did you have any parting comments?
I just apologize for the technical difficulties there. But I think you're getting the gist of a lot of the information, and the real meat of it was a lot of the information that Leslie gave earlier on the background and a little bit of the ideas of historic preservation. And then I think that the questions are better than watching a lot of slides anyway. So.
And we do hope to do a deeper dive into historic preservation and do a workshop, Extreme History Project doing a workshop on this in the coming months. So make sure to watch and look for that if you're interested. And we can dive into more of these terms, into more of these ideas in a little deeper way with the workshop scenario. So if you're interested in that, just, definitely reach out to us and let us know. Okay. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It was so great to see you all on this Zoom call. We had a great audience, and hopefully we'll see you back here again for our next presentation, which is next month, February 24th. We're going to have Dr. Janine Pease speaking about the Crow reservation boarding schools, and then also Carlisle boarding school, and the Crow tribal members who were sent to Carlisle and then came home, and some of their personal experiences with that. It's going to be a great presentation, February 24th, 6 o'clock on Zoom. And this presentation this evening was recorded, so we will have that out on our social media tomorrow, also on our website, and also in our newsletter. So you'll be able to find it in one of those places and pass it on to folks who weren't able to attend tonight. So thank you so much, Leslie and Scott, for the wonderful presentation and the wonderful information that you imparted. We're so glad. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.